On Brickyard Road, North Woodstock in Connecticut, stands an old farmhouse. It was dilapidated and almost beyond repair. It was a huge house compared to the smaller farmhouses that surrounded it, with 16 rooms. The house was built by the Lyons family in the middle of the 18th century, where it became the Lyons Tavern. After they sold the property, it changed hands many times and belonged to the Potters, Redheads, Ides, where it continued to operate as a tavern. From the late 19th century to the late 1940s, it was owned by the Dupre family, where it was no longer a public house, but had become a private residence. Unfortunately for the Dupre family, they'd suffered a family tragedy. One day, Mrs. Emery Dupre had taken some children to school, leaving her 14-year-old daughter Laura alone in the house as she was unwell. Mrs. Dupre had only been gone a short while, and on returning had found the house empty. After a thorough search of the house and the surrounding areas by the police, her daughter had completely disappeared, never to be seen again. No doubt due to the tragedy, the house was put on the market. In 1951, the Viner family decided to buy the property, and although it appeared to be beyond repair, she could see potential, and to renovate it, it would be an exciting challenge. One evening, and about 2 months after moving in, Mrs. Viner and her 11-year-old daughter Sandra were alone in the kitchen downstairs. Her daughter suddenly looked at her mother and asked, "Who is upstairs?" Both mother and daughter could hear footsteps upstairs, but decided to ignore them, thinking it was an old house making noises. But then the sound of footsteps got clearer, and became apparent that this was not the sound of an old house settling. There was someone walking around upstairs. For several minutes, they just listened to the sound of steps walking around. At this stage, Mrs. Viner had had enough. She grabbed a .22 revolver from the cupboard and went in search of whatever was walking around, certain there might be prowlers. What else could it be? The moment she came back into the kitchen with the gun in preparation of heading upstairs, she heard 2 heavy thumps, and then the sound of something crashing to the floor. After that, the walking abruptly ceased and everything fell silent. With the added cacophony of the thumping and crashing of objects, she thought twice about going to investigate, even with the revolver in her hand. She and her daughter were terrified. When her husband arrived home, they all went upstairs to search for whatever had caused the calamity. However, on entering the room where the noise had appeared to come from, they found it empty. There were no broken objects and no sign that anyone had been present. Over the coming weeks, the haunting sounds would repeat itself at the same time every day. Agitated walking, 2 heavy thumps, then the sound of an object crashing to the floor, then silence. The weeks then flowed into months where the noises continued, so much so that they became desensitized to it. Undeterred, they carried on with the renovations until most of the property was eventually restored to its former glory, though there was still more work needed in some of the other bedrooms. Mrs. Viner's mother, Ida Benno, stayed at the house one night and proclaimed, "I am never sleeping in this house again. My God, this house is haunted." She said, "Someone kept walking through my bedroom." Over the months, they had many guests with the same complaints. Over a 10-year period, there was not a single incident where a guest was not disturbed by the same hauntings. One warm September day, Mrs. Viner was feeling in good spirits and set about restoring one of the large upstairs bedrooms. She was painting the window sash and totally oblivious to everything around her and concentrating hard on the job at hand. Suddenly, the room went icy cold. She felt so cold that her body was shuddering and her teeth were chattering. She wrapped her arms around herself to keep warm. It was like a midwinter blast. She immediately thought, "Uh-oh, someone does not like what I'm doing." Then a strong feeling of hatred came over her and she had to stop working. She then felt the presence of someone in the room. She wanted to turn around and see whoever it was, but was too scared to turn her head. She then felt an icy cold hand on her shoulder, which left her in no doubt that someone was not only touching her, but they must be standing directly behind her. She was frozen in fear. When she was finally able to muster the courage to spin around, The frozen hand immediately melted away, and she was staring at an empty room. There was nothing there. She then screamed out, "I don't know who you are or what you are. This is my house, and you will not drive me out of my house." With that, she ran downstairs, still screaming at the top of her voice, and waited until her daughter got home. The evil presence in that bedroom was so overpowering that she refused to go back in there. She told her husband that she would never forget that freezing hand on her shoulder. Instead of selling the house and running away in fear, Mrs. Viner was true to her word, and whatever entity was scaring her were never able to drive her out of the house. As if in a show of defiance, in 1958 they even added to the family by giving birth to 2 more children. In that period, the strange happenings had somewhat subsided, but had Mrs. Viner made a terrible mistake, believing she now had the upper hand? When her daughter Sandra left for college, barely 3 weeks later, the trouble started again. One September night, she was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when she heard a loud explosion coming from the baby's room. As she ran into the room fearing the worst, she found it icy cold. She then looked across to another door which led into the baby's room and found it wide open. She always kept that door shut to keep in the warmth. She could see that the door had opened with such a force that the lock was now bent and the impact left the radiator reverberating. Fortunately, the baby was safe. She then feared that the loud explosion was caused by the oil burner blowing up. She quickly ran down to the basement, but everything was fine. So where did the explosion come from? As she returned to the baby's room, she now felt the strange presence of a young girl. She tried to shake the feeling off, telling herself it was just her imagination, but at the same time fearing that maybe it was related to the previous owner's young daughter Laura, who had gone missing. But hard as she tried, she could not stop thinking about her. Was that missing girl the focal point of the disturbance? One evening when her sister was sitting with her in the living room, a loud crash came from the upstairs room. Mrs. Viner consoled her sister and said, "I'll investigate." Upon entering the room, she found a table had been overturned and thought to herself, no natural force could have done that. The window was closed, but even a strong wind could not have tipped over that table. Fearing intruders, she called in the police, but they found nothing. She was now extremely concerned because if this unseen force could now overturn a heavy table, it could start hurting people. Although she had lived with this entity for years, it had now taken on a threatening overtone. It had gotten to the point that she had discussed with her husband whether they should finally leave. But after years of hard work restoring the property, they still did not want to leave. On days when she was completely alone, she would walk through the house, hoping to come face to face with whatever was haunting them, hoping to reason with it and saying, "Look, this is my house. I have rebuilt it and we intend to stay. Go away and stop what you are doing. It's no use." But when she was ready for confrontation, the ghosts never appeared. Unfortunately, it would always be on its terms. The walking, thumping and crashing now returned, sometimes up to 4 times a week. Mrs. Viner felt that maybe some form of tragedy was being reenacted upstairs by these ghostly entities. Maybe it was just a residual haunting, an imprint of a past tragic event. But then the icy cold hand on her shoulder on that hot September day, or the upturned table, told her that this was happening now. And what about the heavy force that broke the door's lock? These were definitely spirits with minds of their own, trapped in the past and reliving the event over and over again, like an eternal damnation being carried out. One day she decided to repaper one of the upstairs bedrooms, and as she was removing the old wallpaper, the boards underneath became visible. She realised they were the original boards of the house. The wall was now exposed to light, possibly the first time in over 100 years or more. On closer inspection, she found they were splattered in some kind of paint. When she tried to wash it off, the spots turned to bright red, and when she tried again with bleach, the spots turned brown. It suddenly dawned on her that this was not paint but blood. She'd exposed a blood-splattered wall. What horrible incident had once taken place in this room? Could the problems in the house be related to these stains, where someone had possibly lost their life? She went to the local library to seek out more information on the house. She discovered that around the turn of the 19th century, there were two men staying in the tavern. At the same time, there was a young servant woman working there. It appears that both of the men were vying for her affection and fought over her with swords, possibly causing the blood splatters. It appears they both lost their lives in the melee, and the young woman apparently witnessed the fatal drama. As with many stories that are passed down over the years, they become urban legends and somewhat exaggerated. Whether this event actually took place or was the reason for the haunting could never be proved. Were the footsteps and crashing sounds the fight scene being reenacted? Was the cold hand on Mrs. Viner's shoulder the young woman trying to communicate with her or to warn her? Or was the cold hand that of the young teenager that disappeared in the late 1940s? Either way, there is no doubt that the house on Bickyard Road was haunted. Around 1961, the Viner family did eventually move out, and the property stood vacant for many years, quite possibly due to its reputation. By 1966, the house was again starting to fall into deterioration. The plumbing and copper piping were being stolen, and the house would no doubt have faced further vandalism. Maybe over the many years that the house stood derelict, another brave soul had looked at it and thought to renovate it, unaware of the scary phenomena that awaited them inside.